Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time for another little record review. This one is the record Black Drapes for Tomorrow. The band is Shores of Null, an Italian doom metal outfit. The album will be out April 14th on Spinefarm Records. This is obviously coming out before April 14th, so I'd like to thank Spinefarm Records for giving me a little bit of early access to be able to listen to this album. I appreciate it, and that's full disclosure. I did get early access to this, not for a positive review, but merely for a review, though I will be buying the album, and you'll probably know why at the end of this particular video. Now, if you've never heard of Shores of Null, which I find a lot of people haven't, I mentioned that they're an Italian doom metal band. Doom metal is probably the genre I would put them most in, but they do a lot of things that aren't typical of that genre, and they really do a lot of things that kind of move them past that, or really sort of defy most of all these little weird little styles and subgenres we tend to get in metal. Their sort of signature element, they have 2 or 3 big signature elements that really I think make them original and make them worth listening to. And these elements were what really drew me to their first record. This is their second record, Black Drapes for Tomorrow is number 2. Their first one is called Quiescence. And I really liked Quiescence. I think I gave it a 9 out of 10 review. I'd probably revise that to be 8 out of 10, not because, not for any reason other than as I've listened to the album over the last couple of years, more flaws have kind of been presented to me. I still think it's a really good record, and I did like it a lot, and I stand by that sentiment. And maybe because compared to this new record, it's just not quite as good. This new one's pretty good. So their signature elements are this really huge wall of sound they create with guitars not playing in unison. So the guitars are playing harmonies pretty much all the time. Not all the time, but most of the time they're playing harmonies with each other. They're never playing the same thing. They're never playing these sort of standard metal riffs. I'm using the word never, but then I'll expand on that later and say never's not really true. But that's the signature, is these sort of tremolo picked different lines. There's a lot of movement in tenor and alto voices. It's almost like a chorale-like texture. So there's a lot of interest within the harmony and the movement of the harmony that makes the band, I think, really, really fun to listen to. Very, very not typical of what most metal bands tend to do. Most metal bands tend to play these riffs with a lot of power chords. In this case, Shores of Null plays a lot of thirds and a very, very expanded harmonic range. So there's guitars playing high and guitars playing low, and then the bass guitar on the bottom, and it just sort of fills up a huge amount of sonic space. Band sounds really huge when you listen to them, and I think that's really what drew me to them on their first record, and they've brought those same elements into this new record as well. Another signature element is really the vocals. The vocalist for this group is really good. I really, really enjoyed listening to the vocals on the first album and the second album. There's a lot of variety on the vocals, but the main sort of signature element are these really beautiful, clean, and expressive vocals with really, really good harmonies between multiple vocal lines that sort of add into that chorale-like guitar texture, or when the guitar thins out, then the vocals come in and keep this really big harmonic sound going. Much bigger harmonic sound than most metal bands really do these days. And then I guess if I were to pick a third element, it would be the drumming. The drumming tends to use what I call a busy halftime feel, which is the snare and the hi-hats are playing in a halftime rock feel, which gives it that kind of slow, sludgy doom feel. But the bass drums may be playing really, really fast, or lots of different rhythms and that sort of stuff. And then there'll be syncopations offsetting that to kind of produce a lot of interest in the drums. So any single part of the ensemble, there's a lot of interest in it. Even though it's a really big ensemble sound, you end up having this like wave of sound kind of wash over you. And that's really the signature sound of Shores of Null. It's present in this album, and it's expanded in this album, and it's used with even better effect in this new album, Black Drapes for Tomorrow. So with that, let me get you my analysis of those four categories I often talk about: production, performance, composition, general effect. I'm going to start with performance. So the performances on this are really good. If I were going to give it a number, it'd be at least a 9 out of 10, maybe 9.5 out of 10. And the reason is because they all work together so well. It's hard to pick out any one thing that's really good. It's all done really, really well. The drumming, like I mentioned, is very, very interesting. There's always a point of interest in whatever the drummer's doing to kind of offset the big wall of sound that's happening with the guitars. And with multiple listens, you're going to hear the guitars play lots of very intricate lines with each other, and there's lots of little counterpoint going on. One of the flaws I thought that existed in the first album that has been resolved in this album is the lead guitar. I wasn't super into the lead guitar, what they did with that in the first album. with these melodic lines that to me kind of ended up falling flat because of the way that they were performed. In this case, that's not there. They kind of removed the element from the compositions and replaced it with more technical lead guitar playing. But when you have that lead guitar playing, it's set in within this like bigger kind of grinding chord texture that at first makes you think that there isn't lead guitar, and then you listen a little closer and you hear some really intricate stuff. There's not guitar solos the way that you are used to normally hearing them, and that's okay. That's part of their aesthetic and approach, and I think it works. The vocal performance is outstanding on this album. There's just a gigantic amount of variety. You have everything from really soaring, beautiful, clean vocals and great harmonies to this constant use of a death growl. And the death growls are very, I've decided they're pretty effective, and they work pretty well. And then there's even some black metal vocals towards the end of the album that I think just are really effective when we get to hear them. Whenever the vocals come in, it's always like a good moment. And in some cases, the drumming is also really, they'll set up the music to really just showcase one little element of the drumming that all of a sudden becomes this point of interest. And the whole thing really works together well. It's a great ensemble performance. And I always like ensemble performances. If it's hard for me to pick out like who the star of the show is, I really like that. So it all works together really well. Let's do production. So production, if you guys know my general attitude towards production, I tend to be pretty critical of production techniques that involve a lot of compression. And in this case, I think this album really treads a good line between the amount of sort of compression of dynamics that we kind of expect as modern listeners and the amount of dynamic range that's necessary to be expressive. So if I were going to give the production a number, I'd probably say it's a 9 out of 10. There's a couple of little flaws here and there where it's hard to hear things, but most of the time everything's like really crystal clear. And what I love about this album is that it's not mono-volume. Most metal albums over the last 10 plus years have been extremely mono-volume. Every single part of every single song is the same volume. We do not get this with Shores of Null at all. When we thin out the guitar textures, when we're removing guitars or we're pulling them down into a unison, or we're playing clean guitar rather than with lots of saturation and distortion, we feel the energy and the volume level come down. The sound actually gets quieter. Within songs, we have growth and decay of volume across songs and within songs that produces a really good effect. An effect that you're not always aware that you're missing until you hear it actually brought back in. At the same time, the levels are still pretty high most of the time, and so you still get a feeling of like a big, loud, aggressive metal album, rather than something that where you're like having to turn the volume way up to actually like hear it. So it sounded good on my phone, but it also sounded really good, you know, from some near field monitors and stuff. I've given this album a couple of listens. I'm not sure how many, maybe 2 or 3. So it sounds good in a couple of different environments, and that's really good. So it's not going to upset you. It's not like under maximized when you put your earbuds in, and it's not over maximized where everything's like a distorted mono volume pile of garbage, which is really what's popular to do now. So the production's 9 out of 10. The only maybe flaws I might say sometimes, and part of the production too is you may have an instrument that really jumps out of the texture and is louder than the others. I believe it's intentional because I think it's effective. The vocals all of a sudden jump out of the texture and are really clear and clean to hear. You can't actually do that if you have everything really hyper compressed. You can't get those vocals to kind of jump out of the texture. You have to have a little more dynamic range in it. And also, by the way, the compression is not that necessary with the textures that this band uses, because they're using full range of their guitars all the time. That produces enough of a wall of sound that we don't need to like compress it even more to get that perception that things are loud. There's two things that can create perception of loudness. One is the intensity of a pitch or of a particular sound. The other one is the number of frequencies that are being played will also increase the intensity. So if you have a whole orchestra playing, that's a lot of sound, and that's going to produce an effect like that. It's loud because of the amount of frequency saturation. Whereas if you have one instrument playing very loud, it may end up sounding softer, even though the energy level of that one instrument might be high. So because of the way they play, there's just not that much not that much need for compression to make it like have a big kind of impact like that. So yeah, there's some great moments where the vocals really pop out. However, it's a couple of points, particularly with the growling vocals. It's almost like I heard too much detail. I would almost never say that because the detail in the vocals in this is really crisp. You can hear the vocals extremely well. They're not washed with reverb and compression to where they don't sound like a human voice anymore. It sounds extremely natural. But sometimes when you hear the death growls, you can hear it crackling almost too much. And I'm not sure if it's a flaw yet, but I thought I'd point it out. So when you listen to it, you can hear like the crackling of like the mucus on his vocal cords, which is a really kind of, I guess it's just, maybe it's not something I'm used to. Maybe I'm used to hearing those death growls be really compressed and like stuck in the mix. And of course, I think the mix is good. Volume levels are really good. I can hear all the instruments appropriately, and there's still room for certain features to sound out nice and clear. Next one is composition. Now, I think I'm going to give this composition on this album, I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10. The reason it's not a 10, I'll explain, but it's really, really good. It's really, really good. And the things that are really, really good about it is not the composition of the individual riffs and the individual harmonies and individual melodies as much as the composition of the forms of the pieces and the form of the album. This is where this band really shows a lot of talent, is in their understanding of form. Form is the way that you arrange different parts of music, different sections of music to produce the effect. Most of the time, if you're in like the rock genre or even the metal genre, you're going to get a really standard form that's like intro, verse, chorus, bridge, solo, chorus, out, right? There's none of that on this album. They completely rearrange that and kind of turn it on its head. They also turn on its head, and they use that form, by the way, to really, really accent really particular features. So a piece may start with a form that has that big chord texture that I showed, or talked about, the big giant harmonies, that wall of sound, and then we'll get a section that's just a really simple like thrash riff that just pops out, and all of a sudden you get instantly focused on it as a listener. And the quality of that riff, it's not like it's a bad riff, it's not, bad, but its quality is so much more enhanced because of the way that they presented it. An average sounding small part of a section becomes much more effective when you're able to present it in a context that makes the listener focus and feel that is having some effect on them as a listener. And that's what they do throughout the course of this album on every single song. And that's the big place of growth from the first album to this new album, is that the compositions are just on a different level. They're completely expanded. The use of form is really, really good and really, really effective. There are multiple times where I felt surprised to hear something. I couldn't get bored with this particular album. It plays to something I really like in terms of their signature sound, but I really couldn't get bored of that, because anytime that you would get bored of it, they present you something new that you haven't heard before. They bring you into a thrash element. They bring it down low to like a sludge sound. They have like a bass feature. They have like a bring it down to a drum feature. I remember at one point, I'm listening to this and they bring it down to this really simple riff, like really dumb kind of simple, but you realize very quickly that it's there to feature one tiny element. They went from this huge gigantic sound down to this unison riff, and what the feature is this ribbon crash on the drums, on this like offbeat, and you hear that, and all of a sudden your ear focuses in on that. It's like, well, now it's about the ribbon crasher, and that's a really, really cool thing that they were able to accomplish with that, and they did it continually. The other thing they did is not just arranging things in a non-typical way. So you don't have this verse, chorus, bridge thing going on. You have different sections being arranged in different ways, and sometimes you have things without repetition that are brand new and will require a second listen for you to like grasp, rather than repeating the same material. They also took the standard way that a song tends to grow and turned it on its head in a couple of tracks. One of them was Carry On My Tiny Hope, which was one of the standout tracks on the album for me because of this use of form. They started it huge and full, and then they decayed into the sludge and went away that way. So the form of the song, rather than starting here and like growing, they start here and then they just collapse the song into like utter despair and sadness. And that's part of the aesthetic of nu metal and of this band, and it really, I think it works really, really well. And I really, really appreciated hearing somebody that's willing to take those chances and do something that's a little bit different. Metal's been around now for like a long time, like 40 years almost, and more than 40 years. been around. It's been around a long time. So you have to do new stuff, and you have to be able to take stuff from other things and bring it in to keep things fresh. And I think there's a lot of classical influence and a lot of use of form that really, really makes the album shine. So the composition, 9.5 out of 10. The only reason that last half point isn't getting there to maximum value, maximum effectiveness, and it's, to me, it's really hard to give out a 10 for anything unless it's just, I feel like it's perfect and there's no flaws. Is that some of those individual parts are just not that great, right? So some of the individual little sections of a song are maybe just a little bit, undercomposed, I suppose. They're a little bit too simple, or they're not ear grabbing on their own. They just are functional within the form. So it's the form that really stands out. If I were to just rate their use of form and arrangement and organization of their material, I'd give it 10 out of 10 on the form. It's probably some of the best use of form I've heard in a metal record in a long time, maybe ever. I don't know, but it's really good, and that's really what stood out to me, is that use of form. I'm a composer myself, so I think a lot about the form and how I can use that to create an effective performance for my listeners, and I think they did a really good job with that. The last category here is actually general effect. So general effect, to me, is how the whole thing comes together to produce the aesthetic, to produce the effect, how all those things interact to make a great product. And for that, I think the general effect on this is at least a 9 out of 10, maybe 9.5 out of 10, or maybe even 10 out of 10. Everything they use comes together really well. And if you're into the aesthetic that they present, I can't imagine really a better way to have presented what this band is about. So overall, from beginning to end, I liked listening to the album. I never got bored for a single second. And every time they did something new, it at least interested me if it didn't move me. The first album was called Quiescence, and that would probably be a good way to describe the emotional effect of this piece, Quiescence, which is a sort of regard, a quiet regard for what they've done. It doesn't always invoke huge amounts of sadness in me. I'm not a sad person anyway, although I tend to like sad music for some reason. It doesn't invoke like this like crushing sadness in me. It makes me stop and think and listen, and I don't know, it has a quiescent feeling to it. So that was a great name for the first album, even more appropriate in this album. There are like great emotional impacts and great effects in there as well, but there's a lot of moments where you just are regarding what they're doing, and it's not a deep emotional experience as much as it's a thoughtful experience, and that's a little bit different from what we normally feel with like this passionate, aggressive music called metal. So I think the general effect, it's just great. One of the other things about the album, the way the whole album is sort of arranged and what order they put the songs in. The album finishes stronger than it begins. It begins strong, but it finishes really strong. And there's 3 instrumental tracks on this album that kind of enhance the mood of this. The opening track, which begins with the signature sound. It's like, we're reminding you, this is what this band's about. Then by the end, it's just acoustic guitars. And, it's a 3-minute acoustic guitar track that is just sort of like a pandiatonic feel. And you may not know what pandiatonicism is. It's non-functional harmony, but within a tonal sort of selection of notes. That just kind of floats through and then ends. And I think that like really perfectly represents the aesthetic of the band. And those couple of instrumental tracks that we get with acoustic guitars will really bring the volume down and thin out the texture and make a really clear sort of reflective moment. I think that those work just really well. So overall, I'd give this album a 9.5 out of 10. It's good. It's one of the, I'm going to say, in 2017, it's one of the best albums that I've gotten to listen to so far, and I'm pretty sure it's going to be on the rotation for a long time to come. Their first album, I still go back and listen to, even though I think this one is such a huge improvement. I still listen to that first album because it had a great impact on me, and I think this one, in a lot of ways, had a better impact. I will say that as I was trying to listen to this album, I kept wanting to be hypercritical. I'm like, I'm giving this, there's too much credit here. I'm feeling too positive about this. And I couldn't really do it. Like, it was, they just kept doing more interesting things as the album progressed. And it finished really strong. It was a great album. So I do recommend it. It is Shores of Null. Black Drapes for Tomorrow. It'll be out on Spinefarm Records on the 14th. And thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And thank you for listening to this rather long review and analysis of this. The rain has cleared up, and now it's time for me to go. You guys have a great day.